Welcome to Something to Talk About from the Bainbridge Island Senior Community Center. My name is Reed Price. I'm the director of the center. And today we're going to talk about truth and reconciliation and how to be peacemakers as part of our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion programming, and to just make us talk about how we can be better people. I want to start, though, by mentioning that actually Something to Talk About was just named last week as the best of Bainbridge podcast. Thank you very much for your votes in support of this kind of wild and woolly effort. Anyway, I'd also like to thank Fieldstone Communities of Bainbridge Island for sponsoring Something to Talk About. They offer independent living, assisted living, and memory care up on Rolling Bay. You can visit their beautiful campus, learn about day stay and respite programs, and enjoy a free lunch by calling Celia or Jamie at 206-594-1010, 206-594-1010. Also, I would like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the ancestral homeland of the Puget Sound Coast Salish people, specifically the Suquamish, our neighbors, who have lived on the waters of the Salish Sea since time immemorial. We honor them and we continue to learn about how to be better stewards of these lands and waters. Anne Lovejoy, please help me get started on this delightful conversation, I hope. I'm sure it will be interesting, and I'm planning to learn a little bit.
Yeah, I think we all will. Thank you, Reed. And thank you, everybody, for coming. There's a few more people who are probably going to trickle in as they're able. But in the meantime, I would love to hear from some of our panelists. And thank you so much, everybody who's here to participate. Uh, One of the things I think I wanted to kind of start off with is what even is the Truth and Reconciliation movement? Because a lot of people sort of go, well, that sounds weird or whatever. Like, what even is that? And I thought, Susan, I wonder if you would speak to that because I know you've been involved for quite a long time. Susan Griggs.
I would rather defer to Zan because she's
okay.
got much more information.
Go Zan.
I don't know about that, Susan. You can join in. Truth and reconciliation, I think, as many people know, we at least that phrase was coined back with the South African freedom movement, and we're really, we're pretty familiar with that whole process with Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela, and the amazing work that they did in South Africa to turn what was a really horrendous apartheid state, into a more democratic state with very little bloodshed, and it was really pretty amazing. And so, of course, this idea of truth and reconciliation goes back as far as we can trace it, as far as we can trace human efforts to heal and to move forward. And so, but anyway, that term comes from there. After that, one of the people who was part of that movement started something for 20 years after that, which was I'm trying to remember what it was called right now, but he studied them all over the world, truth and reconciliation processes, because people were like, okay, they did in South Africa. How can we do it here? How can we do it in, South America? How can we do it in Europe? How can we do it, all over? And has kept a really amazing resource. And I'll remember it. Maybe Susan will remember it and we can share it with you. And that's continued, which is really interesting, seeing the work that they've done. And since, it's really evolved a lot, there was a lot of criticism about, or critique about, that original one. And, there's somebody, has anybody heard of Dr. Fania Davis and her work down in Oakland and other places? She's Angela Davis's sister. She's a civil rights lawyer, and then became got a PhD in Indigenous studies, and has really propelled the modern, the very recent, in the last 4 or 5 years, this movement towards let's do truth and reconciliation, not just between countries, not just at these huge breaking points, but in counties, in cities, in things that happened 200 years ago, in lynchings, in just on and on. And I guess we found there's like 200 of these going on right now in the United States alone.
Well, one in Washington,
Oh,
right? I mean, Washington State, they're saying this year could be a turning point in our relationships with Indigenous people in Washington State. They're beginning a truth and reconciliation movement, working with a lot of the tribal leaders. And they're doing a draft of a proclamation of support for truth and reconciliation in Washington State. I was really taken with that because it's been, like you said, there's been a lot of global, but bringing it down to something a little more manageable. And I know like several of you are associated with the breaking bread facet, I guess you'd say, of like Kitsap race, which is the eliminate, what is it? Eliminate racism and creating equality, right? Something like that. Um, but that movement too, the breaking bread movement, has been strong in trying to create smaller, like county-wide, or talk to county commissioners, right? I know Akuye has been involved in some of that, and I think you have too, um, Zan, right? So do you feel like there's any progress there, like getting a little more focus on that?
do you want to speak to that, or should I?
Go right ahead.
Okay, and so we've met with the county commissioners a couple times, and we've put out some feelers to a lot of people, and they're interested, but they're like, this is way too big for us, So we're at a point, we're at that funny chicken and the egg point, in which we're like, we need to bring in, as the Kuye says, we need to village our voices. We need to bring in a lot of community leaders of all kinds of different communities and say, what do you want? What is the first step? What should we do? And so we're at that point, but it's kind of hard to do that when we're very amorphous, and we don't have funding, and we're trying to figure out what we can do at this moment. So
Well, right.
that's where we're at.
And Jess, I wondered if I know UCC has been
That's very honest.
UCC has been involved in Truth and Reconciliation, has been invited to be part of that panel too. So I wondered, Jessica, if you have any connection with that or thoughts about how that work might progress. I can't tell if she's
It looks like, oh, there.
might be frozen.
Yeah.
Yeah, there she is.
I don't know how good my internet is. I might have to move. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that faith communities play a giant role in bringing this work to large groups of people who are already primed for peace work. Yeah, I mean, I'm interested to hear what Zan or how amorphous, I guess, sort of what is the challenge?
Yeah, it sounds like you may need to relocate, but that amorphousness is always a challenge. It seems to me as though one of the things that that the larger movements have had is a pivot point, and we just need to sort of help create that pivot point to say we need to move, we need to act, we need to engage, which I guess is what you're hoping to do, right, Zan and Susan, right now?
Yes, we are reaching out to the different communities who have been affected, who we want some healing. So we're calling it racial, truth, racial equity, and transformation, racial healing and transformation. Sorry about that. And so we have sent letters out to the tribes. We've sent letters to other organizations trying to get them on board, because we want those who have been impacted to be the ones who really lead the whole effort. Now, as Zan said, we don't have funds, and we don't really want to take advantage of people who are already marginalized and ask them to do a lot of work without paying them. So that's one of the places that we are at. But at this point, we're trying to get their interest and if they would like to be supporting and be part of it.
So one thing that comes up a lot is people say, well, how do I do that? Like, what does that look like? How do you live into it? And I think that is a big piece for a lot of us. Like you can send a check, maybe, or maybe not. You can march, you can show up for a meeting, but what does it look like when we try to live? I mean, that's why I focus a lot on sort of practical peacemaking, because I feel like the root of reconciliation is peacemaking. And how do we do that? Because heaven knows we don't get a lot of lessons or models in our popular culture for peacemaking or really reconciliation either. I mean, there are some really cool things starting to happen in the justice system, in the penal system, beginnings of true reconciliation movements. But I think for a lot of us, it's like, well, how do I get in? How do I start? What would that look like?
I saw a movie about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Maine, and the indigenous people had been very much mistreated. And so they went to each of the different communities, and it was really other indigenous people who went because they really didn't trust the government who was in charge of the commission, and they didn't trust the white people. And they basically got their stories, and then they had the indigenous individuals testify to a government court and keep a record of all the testimony. So there was a big book with that, because, once you get the people who have hurt you to be able to recognize that they have hurt you and have it something that no one's saying, no, but that was, whatever, the different ways that people deal with finding out that something bad has happened. And from what I gathered, it was very healing and hopefully transformative. That I don't know, but that is one way of doing it. We found out that when the government is in charge, it's really hard to get the people to be buying into it. So that's why we want the money from the county, but we really don't want them to lead the whole effort. We're fine with, their being part of us, but, we want to be careful about that. Now, their response is, have you talked to the cities? Let's get somebody else involved in all. And so we haven't gone to the cities. We have gone to instead all the organizations that really should be part of deciding, because what we think is best may not be the best way to do it.
Well, and also what tends to happen, at least on Bainbridge, is you get a proclamation.
That won't do much.
No, I mean, I have a stack of them on my shelf, right? It's
yeah.
Oh, how nice. And whatever the current council, and they stumble through, I shouldn't say these things, but stumble through reading some of the words that are unfamiliar. And it feels very performative to me. So
right.
Like true engagement is pretty different, but for many people, again, the entry point is kind of mysterious. And you talked about being amorphous. It's like, how do we get more amorphous? How do we get shaky?
One of the things that
I'm sorry.
I was just going to go for it, Susan.
Tanya Davis has come up with the 4 R's in a restorative process. One is recognize harm, unearth and publicize hidden truths. So that's how you get the people who've been harmed to speak up. Then take responsibility for harm, of which we have to have, okay, these different policies have been responsible and we need to change those. And, trying to figure out exactly how the harm has been caused, and then repair harm. And that's the reparations that are commensurate with harm. That's the one that people have heard of and say, oh no, I don't want to do it. That. And then the last is take action to prevent reoccurrence of the harm. So finding out how come the harm happened and making sure that we can not have it happen again. So those would be the 4 things that have to be done. So the first thing is finding out what the harm is and have the people who have been harmed sharing that with others.
Well, it strikes me that the Japanese memorial exclusion memorial is a good example of that, because it begins with the stories, the education, people walking through, getting some kind of experience, and then being able to go out into the community and just like be neighborly to people, right? I mean,
Yeah.
there's a lived piece of that just by the fact that we are an island where they're, on Bainbridge, more than half the people came back after the internment camps. So there's a little different, there's more of a real connection. I've heard a number of people say, oh, I can do that, right? Like, it's here, it's our neighbors. Yeah. But I think it can be, again, it's sort of the vague sense of, who do I apologize to? Or what kind of reparations? Because a lot of times the reparations send are money, which is great, but it isn't a change. And you talked a little earlier about transformation, which in my experience, it's kind of a slow process. Everybody wants the one and done, and it'd be like, it's so cool if you could just like, oh, I get it. I'll never say those things again. But so far, Jess, I see you kind of nodding there. Do you have some?
Well, I'm thinking 2 things, and one is that before you can even engage in those sort of 4 steps, you have to build some trust, and that takes a long time. It takes consistent effort and showing up in ways that aren't that and not putting it in the paper, like that aren't like where you sort of flash in for a second, and you say, for instance, our church shows up, and helps in this way, and then we've got it in the paper, and then we never show up again. And so it's building trust in a way that is without the front page of the paper, without that piece. It has to be, and then the second thing is that I think there is a white Western mindset of wanting to be accomplished, this accomplishment that we have we've done truth and reconciliation, and we've got an idea of what the end looks like. And that is not the reality of it, that it's actually a lived journey that is never ending. There is no, we've done it, and we check that off our accomplishment list and then create the next, thing. Like it's a commitment of this generation starting something that will not be finished in this generation. So thinking in terms of what can this generation do? We're at the building trust stage. That's where we're at. That may be all that this generation can do before we even get to what comes next. And that may be the gift we have. And then thinking, who is going to carry this on after this generation, and making sure that the next generation knows that this work is begun and what might be next.
So the education piece is that, it seems like, right? It's like, if we don't tell the stories, if we don't hear the stories,
right,
pass the stories on, doesn't matter what we do, kind of.
Yes. Yeah. Telling the truth,
Well, right, because it's not a mistake to say it's truth and reconciliation. One of the pieces too that always comes up is people say to me, "Oh, I really like that idea, but it's so uncomfortable to." And I was like, "Yeah, it kind of is, right?" But being uncomfortable is a big piece of truth telling.
Mhm,
And it's a big, big, big piece of truth listening.
mhm,
And I think for a lot of us, the truth listening part, you know, because we're such a shame-based culture, I think it triggers shame for people. It triggers like, I don't want to talk about it. I didn't do that. I can't help. Like all those defensive responses. So it's like how to engage people in a story without triggering that. And I think about some really, well, I think about like a Robin Kimmerer who wrote Braiding Sweetgrass, right? That she tells
mhm.
all these stories in such an engaging way that you can get drawn in. And people have said stuff like, I didn't realize it was that kind of book, right? It's like I actually learned a lot, but I didn't mean to. I thought I was reading about herbs. Um, but it's like sometimes the story can be compelling enough that people will get drawn in and start to have some empathy. And I think that's another key piece is like being vulnerable enough to listen and being vulnerable enough to hear so that we become actually empathetic and not defensive. So, maybe part of it is education in storytelling, helping our younger generations learn how to tell a story without alienating people, but also without softening it and not sugarcoating. It's tricky. This is tough work. But I think that's really a big piece. I don't know. Read.
Well, several years ago, I went with a group to Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, and we were doing a little mission work, talk about, white savior mentality. But we got there, and the group called Remember said, okay, you can help with these projects during the day, but your job at night is just to listen. And so we were an audience and attentive, active listening audience for the natives who lived on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation to say what had happened there. And um, and the idea was don't respond. So I feel like to some of what you're saying about storytelling, it's really about honoring storytellers that we can pass on to our next generation. The idea of letting somebody have their time to talk and you don't have to respond immediately. I remember hearing something about learning that turtles communicate, and there's like a full minute in between when a turtle talks and the other turtle responds. We could we could do with that a little bit of stopping before we respond.
Well, and it sounds like what that story listening is an element that might be an education element too, right? How to
Mhm.
hear a story, see your own stuff come up, sit with it, not react to it, but respond to it in an interior way, maybe, right? So I'm looking for this. To me, this ties into the practical peacemaking because it's like those are the skill places. If we do some workshops or we work with kids or we work with, doesn't matter what age group it is because we're all living our full lives, right? But thinking about skill sets, the storytelling is one, but story listening is another, right? Truth telling is one and truth listening is another. So those parallel pieces might be really good places to begin if we're going to do some practical work.
Mhm.
Zan, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I know. I love this. And I think we're woefully as a culture, underprepared, unprepared to do reconciliation work, or as you say, to tell these, how do we tell our truth that it can be heard, and how do we listen to somebody else's story without reacting? And how do we reconcile? What are the tools that we need to be able to with our loved ones, which is sometimes the hardest. thing to do is to reconcile with each other, or in a group, when you're doing this work together and something goes wrong, do you just throw out, a scapegoat, or how do you bring somebody back into the work, And I think these are really practical skills, day-to-day skills. They're not easy. They're not easy.
True story. I was actually thinking, you had mentioned that this is the beginning of the High Holy Days. This is uh, the new year, right? Rosh Hashanah, and leading up to the Day of Atonement, which I've always been really taken with that idea. It's like we all need, like, we ought to have a lot more Day of Atonement. We should have a Day of Atonement every month or every week or something. Like, seriously, because it helps you really focus on the fact that there's a lot to atone for, and that atoning is work. It isn't just sitting around feeling terrible. It's like making atonement is reparation, right? And some of that work is really important. Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I'm deep in that now because the new moon coming up on Wednesday is Rosh Hashanah. So, and as a rabbinic teacher, I'm just like so deep in it. But the month before the last new moon to the last, new moon was the month of Elul, and that's the month of Tshuva, it's called, which is turning and returning.
Mm.
Which is really, so you're like, what am I turning away from? What is not serving me? What am I wanting to return toward? Turn to, and who do I need to turn toward? And who do I need to return to? And so it's really a time of, I think, because the fall is this time of facing death. It has this feeling to it. So each year you do like a little rehearsal. It's like, oh, if I die, what threads are not, are left untied? Who do I wish I had reconciled with, which I haven't? What relationships that are dear to me are still, in knots a little bit, and how can I make it right with people? So that's a big piece of this community work, is how do I make it right with each other? And then there's also, looking at yourself. How can I really, with the parts of yourself, how can I make that right? And then how can I look at the way I'm living, and my connection with, the source of life? How can I make that right? So there's all those pieces, but the community piece is really a big one. And I think we need that.
Oh, definitely. Jess, I know you've done a lot of sort of reconciliation work in your lifetime. Um, what, how can you, what would be, some helpful direction, I guess, to say?
What was the football things? Who says? Jessica, go for it. I'd love to hear
Yeah.
it.
I mean, I think part of um, part of the work of the person who is attempting to make amends is getting clear on the wrong and being able to name that accurately. And I think that is work that can be done without necessarily sometimes even including and in some ways re-traumatizing, right, the person that was harmed. You don't necessarily want to force someone to tell you what you did. The in the 12 steps, there is there's a process of naming the grievances that you hold, the resentments that you yourself hold against others. And in the grievances that you hold, the unresolved things in your heart, those are the places that you need to make amends, you know? So you've got your sort of list of resentments and people that you are like, this person has done me wrong, and this is something that's unresolved in my life, and then you flip it, and those actually become the people that you need to make amends to. And a lot of the time, you know exactly what your part has been in it. You don't need to go to that person and try to get them to tell you what it was. That's work that you do, not just on your own, but with people in your community. So, for instance, you know, if we're thinking in terms of historically, you know, I'm thinking in terms of how Christian churches supported, you know, genocide and the doctrine of discovery, and so how to go and make amends for this without re-traumatizing the people that we've harmed. That involves making relationships, real, authentic, truthful relationships, not just with the people that you've harmed, but with amongst yourselves, with other faith communities, starting so that you all can tell one another the truth about yourselves, and about what happened, and naming the truth of what you know before you even offer amends of any kind. And then, which I think the you know, churches haven't done well, which is then asking what is the how is the offering going to be received? I think Western white folks often go to writing what you were talking about earlier, Anne, about writing proclamations. We're so comfortable writing proclamations or letters. I've read so many like repudiations of the doctrine of discovery, and yet who's that serving? You know, so we know the truth. What do we do with it? How are we making peace with that? How are we, you know, it's not just reconciling, I guess, so that we feel better. We may never feel better. It might not be reconciled ever in our hearts. So what is, you know, what are we trying to reconcile? You know, is it our own hearts so that we feel better? Or is it our relationships? Or is it how we behave? Because then that becomes your living amends.
Sheila, I see you nodding away happily. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm nodding. I know what Jessica's talking about. What happened to me when you started talking about this was my experience with the Dispute Resolution Center. And the process, the process which made my AA experience very real. In the dispute resolution process, as a mediator, I did little or nothing other than to keep things going in the process. The whole idea, though, at the end was maybe there's no reconciliation. Maybe there's no guarantee of anything happening at the end of that. That's hoped for, but that doesn't happen. And I'm thinking primarily of a divorced couple, which is a pretty easy one to talk about, and that there are children involved. And that the point being is that the transformation really is, we hope as mediators that the parties heard each other. And we talked about that a little bit ago. 20 minutes or so ago about hearing each other. And but the process builds to that. I mean, you don't start out with that, obviously. You start out with a trust that this is okay, we can do this. But the ending, and I've seen some miraculous transformations of people acknowledging each other, shall I say? I think that's a good way to put it, acknowledging each other. And even though they may not agree with whatever the process, what was ever, but at least they heard each other. And I think, to me, that's, I weep on that, because to me, that's extraordinary. That's an extraordinary place to be.
Thank you, Sheila. That's beautiful. Kimi, do you want to jump in?
There's so much harm done. And historically, I think we recognize, I mean, you mentioned the Japanese, but there's, you know I saw that movie too, the one set in Maine, and that was very powerful. It was very localized, but it's generalizable too. I mean, if you see that, you can see how those people aren't any different than any place else. And this process worked because of all the things that were mentioned here. But there's no possibility, I don't think, of reconciliation if the truth comes out. And that truth is just in what is shared by the people who are harmed. And, you're serving as a witness. And I also think there's, like, if we have to acknowledge too that our government is not organized in a way that allows for truth-telling. And as a former educator, I was totally ignorant about the things that I should have known. And I knew things in our family, but I should have known about, the indigenous people. I mean, but I think, I was just reading this list. There has to be some level of political will involved. And to say, that's how Canada said, we cannot believe how many children we have killed and lives we've destroyed. And I think that country has come to terms with their history by that official process. And I think there isn't a reason why we can't, try to affect that kind of wider change, because we can talk amongst ourselves forever. But I don't know how we come to focusing on, I always want to go to the ones who have been harmed the most. And as far as I can see, historically, 400 years is long enough for slavery. And so I always want to go there, but, maybe it's too much. But it's still played out in every aspect of our lives that are important for us: health, education. Unless we recognize and follow those thread lines to that original sin of our country, that it was based on race. I don't think, we're just not moving chairs on the Titanic, but with the other stories, we can see the possibility that maybe we've grown as a society to accept that there are things that we need to dig deeper and harder and agree on what we know to be true. And then you can have reconciliation. But if we don't agree on what happened, then we're always fighting, mythology and racism. So anyway.
Or a lot of other isms too. Barbara, did you want to?
I just have a small observation. I recently came back from a trip to Eastern Canada, and I've been paying attention to the things that the Canadian government is acknowledging. And for a couple of years there, I was listening to a CBC, a Canadian Broadcast Corporation, radio show called As It Happens, and they would talk about the truth and reconciliation conversations there. And so I went to Canada. It was Montreal, Quebec, Ottawa, and Quebec. Toronto, Montreal, Quebec City, and Ottawa, and everything. It was a tour. Everything was Catholic statues. It was historical figures that were the invaders, and so I was really surprised that was the focus of so much of the information, as if the culture didn't start until the arrivals from Europe. And I was just kind of saddened and disappointed that that's what it was, that it wasn't more expansive and honest in terms of what he was willing or able to talk about as a tour guide. He was really well informed, really kind-hearted, but the cultural prism that he was using was not what I had hoped or expected, a little bit, maybe.
And those symbols really do,
Mhm.
whether you take them in consciously or unconsciously. Susan, I think about you every time we drive past Siebold Methodist Church, and no matter how many times people tear down those beautiful signs about LGBTQ inclusion, you put them back up again, right? And
Yep.
it's just a symbol, but it's a symbol that it's both ways. It's like you're replacing them over and over and over is another symbol, right? It's like, and that's happened at Eagle Harbor Church too, right? Justin, that happened recently. But it's like when the statues come down, there's a kind of a ruckus that gets kicked in a lot of time. We're seeing that around our country too, where people are pulling down statues of truly disreputable people, and then getting a lot of heat for a cultural destruction. And you're like, it's so complicated, and it's so interesting to me that how we perceive a symbol carved in marble somehow makes it more important for, I mean, isn't that just, it's sort of that European thing though, right? I mean, it's a piece of that European culture that sort of says these are our special, all men, all white men, right? And
Well, there were a few women, but they were religious figures, or women giving aid and comfort to people. It was really kind of shocking to me. And then there were some really appalling images of indigenous people, like at the foot of the conquerors, and the conqueror in a noble pose looking off in the distance. And I thought, boy, they need some sledgehammers up here.
Yep.
exactly. Well, it looks like Akuya might be able to join us.
I would just drop in here something about, Robert Fulgham and all I ever needed to know I learned in kindergarten. Well, maybe not exactly, but one thing about the idea of making amends, about being honest, about being clearing your heart from bad thoughts or rude things that you said, I mean, we tell young children all the time to do this, and that you will feel better when you release the secret or admit the wrong. It's gonna release you. And of course, it's true, but it's so hard to remember. And obviously, when you start to put up proclamations in marble to try to persuade yourself that what you want to believe is what is true, it becomes even harder to back yourself out of those lies. But
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
oh, I was just going to say, I also think that there's a bit of, tyranny. There's an intentional thing to um, tell us who we are. That
Mhm.
there are, forces of control, governments or religions or whatever, telling us who we are. And these statues are there to try to convince us who we're supposed to think of when we are we. And particularly white people, that we're sort of, when everyone's colonized, and then we say this is who we are and this is who they are. And so I think the first thing that we can do is think about who we are. When you say to yourself we, who are you thinking of? And then live from that place. Then when you go about your day, your life, whatever, making sure that you're we, that you've had, maybe you didn't put it in here, who your we is. Somebody else told you who we is. and so think about that. What is your automatic response to we? And then when you see those statues, realizing that's not my we. This isn't my, my we is larger than this. This is my we story is the bigger story.
Akuya, you spent a lot of time looking at hidden history and kind of exposing that same thing, that we is a lot bigger than the statues of old white guys or whatever. But I think part of your work too has been bringing these hidden truths out to the public, making sure things are not forgotten. As a cultural historian, do you want to say a little about that work?
One of the, I never even thought about being a cultural custodian or historian or archivist for human history until I migrated to Washington State via Uncle Sam. When we arrived here, I found that we were one of the only African American families on Bainbridge Island. And, the challenges and the difficulties my children and I had in the community really was the catalyst for my advocacy for multicultural education, for inclusivity, for equity, for diversity, because I had grown up in environments and regions that was more inclusive. And when I got here, I found that we were totally erased from the footprints, from the state archives, from the cities, and from the regional, footprints of human history and our contributions and what those contributions were, and began to search for identity in Kitsap County, and found that Kitsap County was a very supremacist, very one-sided, not inclusive for even the indigenous communities that the land on which we were residing. Saw that, as I began to unearth the truth and unearth some of the history, found out even the Japanese American community, the removal, as well as not just the removal, but found out that in 1855, there was the first internment that the Japanese American community was not the first interned on Bainbridge Island, but the second internment and removal of natives from their own land to what is now called Suquamish. You know, and it said they were interned to the reservation that is now called Suquamish. And who they removed was natives, slaves, and Asians. And I said, well, who were the slaves? Because in 1855, the emancipation had not yet happened. So who were the slaves that they had removed and interned? And so that began my search. That's when I began to say, okay, was this story just a removal? Was this story an erasure? What was going on? And so that began my advocacy as a cultural custodian. I never, it wasn't like I woke up and say, this is what I want to go to school for. It wasn't that. It was about, really, the humanity that was being erased in this region was appalling to me.
Mhm.
Yeah. And even when I inquired about, the footprints that, some of the Bladel Reserve was owned by African Americans. And that that story totally erased, their contributions to building up this area back to the 1800s, and their role in maritime, their role in building the bases, their role in building the community and the county was totally erased. And so, yeah, I'm a strong advocate for, inclusivity and for just speaking the truth of the contribution of diverse communities to this Washington state, to this region.
We've been talking a little about the power of storytelling, but also how a lot of us need some help in story listening. And that truth telling is really important, but truth listening is really important too.
Yeah.
And I know you've done so much truth telling and so much storytelling, but we only have a few minutes, but do you have any thoughts to share about how to become a better listener?
Well, I think it is about, because our communities are so divided. And because we've always been siloed in this region and in a lot of different regions in our nation, that until we begin to build and strengthen healthy relationships and be able to break down those barriers and really build community in a way where healing and reconciliation can happen. We were intentional with Kitsap Erase. We were intentional with REN, with the Race Equity Network, even though it was a challenge. We wanted to cultivate the engaging and being able to fellowship in a way that wasn't intimidating, that was really celebrating one another and celebrating who we are as human beings and as a community. But even that became political. Even that became difficult. Even that became competitive and very what I would call disruptive in the way that we were moving together. But it was only the seeds of what was already there that began to manifest in how we engaged with one another. So yeah, when we talk about restorative practice and healing and reconciliation, if we don't do that work out the gate, then as we continue to move forward some of this equity and inclusion work, we'll find out that the manifestation of those divisions will present themselves again, because there's nothing new under the sun. What's in a man will come out. And so we see that those practices begin to manifest themselves as we even move forward to what we call doing the good work of equity, inclusion, and diversity. And that's a challenge. And so if we're not even wanting to speak truthfully to one another about what are our challenges as we try to do this work. Because we come from a place, when you talk about people that have been scarred, traumatized, and you have to know the depth of what you're trying to accomplish here when you're talking about healing and reconciliation. And it's not a walk in the park, and it's not an easy, just jump on in there and we're just going to jump on the bandwagon of race, equity, and inclusion, because once you get in that murky, muddy water, you'll find out that, sometimes it's a swamp in here. And we're trying to clean up the swamp. And that's not an easy task to do.
Kimi.
I agree with all of that, Akuye. It's an ongoing journey, and it's hard to be an individual and be part of that and try to resolve it on multiple levels, a very, very personal level as well as a systemic level. But I do want people to know there are high notes too.
Yes.
And the recent Latino festival at the North Kitsap School District, that's a battle in 2 years of making. And a lot of people were on the ground fighting every step of the way. When you think that the largest demographic group in our county has had no recognition that has been formalized, and in a place where blatant racism had been occurring, for this celebration to have occurred in the manner in which it unfolded, the leaders who developed it were from the community, with allies supporting but not usurping any of the decisions. I think that we really should be proud of what happened. So things can change.
And we just had the Latino Festival at Olympic College this past Saturday, which is a tremendous testament to moving equity and inclusion forward here in our community, in our county, in our cities. And the more that we can begin to do this unified, collective, collaborative, because it is going to take all of us. When the young woman here, I've not met her, begin to talk about, Miss Jessica, when you said, who are we? I've always moved from the model of our, we, and us. Our responsibility as human beings, we are responsible for the mess that we're in, and it's going to take all of us to clean it up. So no, it is our we-us that has to come together in a collective, collaborative way to address these disparities, address these challenging issues that continue to surface in our community. And I always say, it's not if these things are going to present itself, but when. How will we respond when they begin to present themselves? That's important to keep at the forefront, because racism has not gone away.
Zan, did you want to?
Just wanted to add, just much appreciation, Akuye and Kimi, for speaking. And just that I really, at the Latino Festival that was held on North Kitsap School District property, that was a very deliberate decision as a symbol and as an action of truth and reconciliation by the Latinx folks who organized that, and who are also the people who really pushed so hard on the district to look at the racism and to make some substantive change. And with the help of a little grease and some cameras and some signs, that happened. And it's happening. It's a work in progress. But I felt like, wow, this is a truth and racial healing event. That this is not just a festival, as Akuye was saying. It's so much more than that. So It's very inspiring. And one of the things that we've done, Akuye, Susan, a group of us, is look at the county and say, wow, there is so much truth and reconciliation work that's going on as we speak. You know, Akuye is doing a ton of work, and so are so many of you in the circle. You know, there's so much work going on. And once we start to see it, you know, you start to see this umbrella of how we are, it's not how do we start this work? It's how do we keep going? How do we keep networking it together? How can we keep bringing it forward and making it stronger by seeing it in each other and recognizing each other and knitting ourselves together. So.
Well, and Kimi, I want to thank you because our time is kind of getting short, but to end on a high note is really great because it is a good reminder that we keep going because we allow ourselves to celebrate the things that are positive. And that's just really important that we not just get, because it's so easy to get despairing or overwhelmed, like it's my middle name. But to go on, is laughing at me, but it is. I think to keep going because we need to lift each other. We need to keep lifting all these things and remember that that is really a high point for everybody. So thank you so much, everyone. What a beautiful conversation. No wonder this is the best podcast on Bainbridge, right?
That's right.